Hey, Wellness Warriors. Welcome to the Burnout Resolution Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Milen Riobe. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a board-certified medical doctor specializing in the areas of functional integrative medicine. I'm also a Chinese medicine practitioner, as well as an OBGYN. Today, we're going to talk about why fiber maxing can backfire and actually fuel your burnout instead of your gut. Not sure if you've seen those videos circulating on TikTok, the latest TikTok trend about maxing out your fiber as a health hack to heal your gut. And of course, you'll see just as many videos talking about the side effects that people have been experiencing in trying to reach these goals of fiber maxing. And so what fiber maxing is trying to get 40 to 50 grams of fiber in each and every day, often through the encouragement of eating lots of beans, lentils, chia seeds, and psyllium. And while the concept on its surface is a good idea, when we dive a little bit deeper, we can see how there are missing pieces of the puzzle that are being ignored by this trend that are leading people down the road of burnout and worsened gut health. So yes, fiber is extremely important, and yes, we notoriously undereat fiber. In fact, the average American only gets half the amount of fiber or less than what's recommended. The recommended amount of fiber varies somewhere between 30 to 40 grams per day, with women requiring slightly less than men. So while it is true that we undereat fiber and that's not good for us, one of the things that's missing is what we're going to talk about today that actually fuels your burnout if you're not careful. So while these trends look kind of fun and harmless, there's a truth that no one's talking about. We're going to tackle that today. And so very often when people have side effects from cranking up their fiber, they'll experience things like bloating, loose stools, worsening constipation. And what people are advising them to do is just take it slow and drink more water. However, when your body tells you that something is going wrong, taking it slower isn't necessarily always the best answer. And very often, one of the main reasons that people actually start to cut fiber out of their diet is because the fiber makes them feel poorly. It does cause the bloating, it does cause the constipation and the diarrhea. So they slowly start to shave these things out of their diets that are causing them this distress so that they don't experience the symptoms. Now, it's not necessarily the food that's the problem. It's the ecosystem that the food is going into that's the problem. And so if you just take it slower and drink more water, you're not taking into account what your ecosystem is telling you is wrong. It's like you've broken your foot, but you don't get a cast, and you're not allowed to have crutches, and you have to walk on your foot. And when you complain to your doctor, they just say, well, just walk a little slower. And so, yes, it'll hurt less if you walk a little slower, but that's not going to necessarily help your foot heal any better. So this is the equivalent of what happens when we tell people, well, if the fiber that you're eating is making you feel poorly, just to crank up the amount slower and drink more water. It's just simply not the right solution. And we'll talk about why today and what you can do instead. So there's a way that you can actually use those symptoms and side effects as a clue that something is wrong. And we'll talk about how you can do that and how these side effects are actually your body wanting to warn you that there's an issue. When you're taking in more fiber, sometimes what you're doing is you're feeding the enemy instead of the ally. So if we liken this to having a garden where we've planted lots of vegetables and fruits, if we just fertilize the garden and don't pay attention to the weeds, we're going to be feeding the weeds as well. When you feed the weeds and they grow, they're going to compete with the vegetables and the fruits for the nutrients in the soil. And if we're not careful, we're not going to get the harvest of the vegetables and fruits that we expect. This is exactly what happens when we start to crank up the fiber and just indiscriminately eat more fiber. If there are weeds in your gut, instead of the vegetables and fruits that you planted, you're going to feed the weeds as well as the fruits and vegetables. In the gut ecosystem, what that means is you're going to feed bad bacteria that don't belong in your gut, as well as the friendly bacteria that do belong in your gut that we call the microbiome. So many times when people are having these side effects, they get the bloating, they get the constipation, the loose stools. With increasing their fiber, it's because there are so-called bad bacteria in their gut somewhere that are feeding off of these. They don't behave the same way as the microbiome. They're not as friendly to us. So they spew out toxins and junk and garbage when they eat the fiber. So even though the fiber itself is healthy, there's nothing wrong with beans and legumes and chia seeds, and they're healthy options of nutrients that we can consume in our diets. So it's not the food that's the problem. It's what is eating the food that's the problem. So we know that what we eat changes our microbiome. And we'll talk about the microbiome a little bit more in depth and just how important it is for all of our body functions. Sometimes the microbiome has unwelcomed guests living amongst them or sometimes above them in the small intestine. These are the bugs that are eating the healthy foods that are producing the side effects that people often experience with fiber maxing in this new trend. So fiber maxing often involves 40 to 50 grams of fiber, right? More is better is the philosophy. So while the recommendation is about 30 to 40, they're recommending a little bit more just to jumpstart the gut. And so the reason it's popular is because we do underconsume fiber. We are notoriously not meeting our requirements for fiber. Fiber is extremely important for the microbiome, for the ecosystem of our gastrointestinal system. But here's what's missing. In a healthy gut ecosystem where your microbiome is healthy, more fiber is a good thing. But when there is what we call dysbiosis, when there is imbalance of the good bacteria and potentially unwelcome bacteria, then it turns into a problem and can make you feel pretty sick. And if that's you, if they do make you feel poorly, that's a huge hint that something abnormal is going on in your gastrointestinal system that you should pay attention to. So your gut's like a community garden. You're planting all these vegetables and herbs and fruits. So we can liken the herbs, vegetables, and fruits to the good bacteria, the microbiome that belong in our gastrointestinal system. The microbiome is extremely important, and I believe it's going to be recognized as an organ of the human body. It's that important. So it'll be an organ like the liver or the pancreas or the small intestine or the heart or the lung. So the reason why the microbiome is so important is because in 2012, we performed what's called the Human Microbiome Project. And we realized that the microbiome of the human body contains 4 to 5 million genes or more that are essential to our body function. There are functions that the microbiome performs for us that we can't do for ourselves. For example, humans don't make the enzymes that are necessary to digest most plant fiber or resistant starches, or what we call FODMAPs, fructooligosaccharides. So the good bacteria, our microbiome, actually ferments these fibers and these oligosaccharides and resistant starches into what we call short-chain fatty acids, the most prevalent of which is butyric acid, which is a ketone. The cells of our colon are fueled by butyric acid. The integrity of the lining of our gastrointestinal system is maintained by this butyric acid that our good bacteria make out of the plant fibers, the insoluble fibers, the resistant starches, and the oligosaccharides that we consume. Oligosaccharides are a type of carbohydrate. They also convert these foods into other kinds of short-chain fatty acids, such as propionic acid and acetic acid, which help us to regulate our blood sugar, our lipids, like cholesterol, for example, and control our appetite. The microbiome also makes vitamin K for us, which is a clotting factor, which is also essential for bone and heart health as well. Many B vitamins are actually produced by the microbiome. So vitamin B1, B2, B6, B12, folic acid, and biotin are actually made by the microbiome. These vitamins are critical for our metabolism, removal of toxins, as well as to make our neurotransmitters to control our mood. The microbiome also breaks down what we call polyphenols that we find in berries, green tea, and various spices into what we call bioactive metabolites that we use for our body functions. that we otherwise wouldn't be able to access for ourselves. So the butyric acid, the acetic acid, and the propionic acid I just mentioned are an example of these bioactive metabolites. They also control our inflammation. So they tell the immune system when it's done enough. It helps to turn off inflammation. So it's our body's natural anti-inflammatory control. They also help to grow what we call T regulatory cells. So T cells are part of our immune system, which help to prevent autoimmunity. They help to control our immune system and prevent it from attacking itself. This is all from the byproducts of our microbiome and what they produce in response to the food that we give them. They also help maintain the integrity of the mucous membranes, which in previous podcasts we've talked about the mucous membranes and how they help protect us from viruses and invaders, and that the mucous membrane actually lines pretty much our entire respiratory tract as well as our gastrointestinal system. So there's this very thin lining that protects us. It's a protective barrier that keeps things out of our bodies that don't belong in our bodies. These metabolites also keep our gut lining integrity intact. They prevent leaky gut and help prevent systemic inflammation that often results from leaky gut. If the function of the microbiome is not intact, we experience brain fog, fatigue, inflammation, joint pain, mood swings, essentially burnout. The microbiome also converts polyphenols into antioxidants, which are extremely important for preventing damage from stress in our bodies. Essentially, they protect us from chronic diseases. The microbiome is in sharp contrast to what we would call the weeds of a garden. So these are what we call pathogenic or unfriendly bacteria that often find their way into the gastrointestinal system, especially if we're under chronic stress. Often these bacteria will end up in places they don't belong, such as the small intestine. We call that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. They can also end up living in the microbiome itself. And sometimes we'll see them in a functional stool analysis as what they call additional bacteria. So they're not part of the microbiome, they're just hanging out in the colon. Very often they're also hanging out in the small intestine, which is where we absorb our food. So these are what we would liken to weeds of a garden. When we look at fiber, what fiber is essentially fertilizer. So if you don't have a bunch of weeds in your garden and you put fertilizer on it, you're going to feed the vegetables, the fruits, and the herbs. You're going to enrich the soil and provide more nourishment for them. Now, if there are weeds in your garden and you put that fertilizer in your garden, you're going to strengthen the weeds, which again is going to rob the herbs, the vegetables, and the fruits of their nutrients, which is in turn going to rob you of your nutrients when you turn around and you eat them. And so this is the issue with fiber maxing, is we don't know what kind of garden we're putting this fertilizer into. Now, the way that this can be a great litmus test is when you put that fertilizer in and you don't feel good. That's all you need to know that there are weeds in your garden. Just like all you need to do is go look at your garden and see that there are weeds growing. We obviously can't look inside of our own guts. However, our body is expert at telling us what's going on. And our bodies will very quickly let us know, hey, something's not right in here. Come and fix it. And that's what we experience as the bloating, the constipation, and the loose stools when we eat too much fiber. Now, again, it's not that we're eating too much fiber. It's that we're eating more fiber than the body can handle because of the weeds. The weeds are thriving on this fiber. You know, the weeds are thriving on the fertilizer. And we all know the weeds grow way faster than the plants we're actually trying to grow, right? We've all experienced that. And they seem to be a lot hardier and resistant. So the same thing goes on in the gastrointestinal system. So if we're just putting fiber in there and we don't know what the ecosystem of the gastrointestinal system looks like, we don't know if our microbiome is healthy, and we don't know if they have unwelcome visitors. If we don't know that, and we just put the fiber in, our bodies are going to quickly tell us through these signs and symptoms of the bloating, the constipation, and the diarrhea that, hey, there are weeds in here, come and fix it. This is what we're missing with fiber maxing. And this is where the advice of just increase your fiber slower and drink more water is just not the right advice. Now, will that help your symptoms? Yes. but your body is really giving you a huge hint as to what's going on. So if you really want to be healthy, you really do have to go down and check for those weeds and get rid of them. Then you feed your garden. Then you get the benefits. So there are certain types of fibers that are more friendly to the weeds. We call these high FODMAP fibers. So there are certain types of fructooligosaccharides that the weeds, the so-called bad bacteria, the unwelcome visitors in your gut, love to eat. They thrive on them. This includes oats, psyllium, and beans, as an example. And so this is a lot of the food that's actually recommended in the fiber maxing, and this is why people have so many side effects. Now, high FODMAP foods are known to trigger the bacteria that cause SIBO. They simply like them more. They thrive off of them more. Now, their metabolism is not as friendly to us as the microbiome metabolism. So while the microbiome metabolism is there to help us to thrive and be healthier, when there is what we call dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of the microbiome, usually driven by our diets, toxins, or infections in the gastrointestinal system. So when dysbiosis is present and infections are present, the weeds, when we eat these foods, we're actually fueling the infections and we're fueling the dysbiosis, which means we're fueling our burnout. So that's not a sign that you should move slower. That's a sign that you should see a functional medical doctor and potentially a gastroenterologist. Now, most gastroenterologists don't do what we call functional stool testing, so they won't see the dysbiosis. They won't really test for the microbiome. Given the importance of the microbiome, it's extremely important to have it tested and to also make sure that you don't have infection in your gut. So there can also be yeast and parasites, not just bacteria, that are invading and causing the dysbiosis or the imbalance of the microbiome. So a functional stool analysis will show you if you have yeast and parasites and additional bacteria, whereas a regular stool analysis that you might get at a regular lab, yes, it'll look for yeast, it'll look for parasites, but it'll only tell you if you have what they call pathogenic bacteria or infectious bacteria. There's a way that you can have also non-pathogenic or non-infectious bacteria living in the microbiome, still disturbing them and causing dysbiosis. So the regular stool analysis that we might get at a regular doctor's office or a gastroenterologist's office does not look for that. And so this is where functional integrative medicine comes in. There are tests in functional integrative medicine where we do a complete analysis of the gut ecosystem itself, looking for the amount of good bacteria you have, looking for the balance that they have, looking for short-chain fatty acids to see if they're functioning properly, as well as looking for the infections that we talked about and inflammatory markers, looking to see if you are making your enzymes properly, whether or not there's a significant amount of inflammation or damage to the lining of the gastrointestinal system. This is all extremely important if you're doing fiber maxing and you realize that you're having side effects. So the key is to get the weeds out and to make the garden healthier overall before you put the fertilizer in. Then you're feeding the right bugs. The other really important tool, if you're having side effects from fiber maxing, is to make sure you don't have an infection called SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is notoriously underdiagnosed because it wasn't officially recognized by mainstream medicine until January of 2024. There are still many doctors who don't test for SIBO or don't recognize SIBO, despite it having been officially recognized a year and a half ago. Another really important thing to talk about with the microbiome is, again, the genes. So the human body, our own cells, only have about 25,000 genes, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to the microbiome. The microbiome has 4 million to 5 million genes, as opposed to our measly 20,000. So the human body has the same number of genes as a house plant. So the rubber plant or the money tree that's in the corner has as many genes as you do. Now, genes are extremely susceptible to their environment, especially the genes of the microbiome, and in our own cells, what we call the mitochondrial genes are extremely susceptible to the environment. In other words, the environment where they live inside the cells where they live. And whatever goes on out here goes on in here, ends up in your cells. And so every bite of food that you take actually alters your microbiome. That's how they decide what to turn on, what to turn off, is in response to the food that you're taking in. If you're not consuming the foods that have the polyphenols, they can't convert them into the usable or what we call bioactive metabolites that we need. If you're not consuming the proper fibers, they can't convert them into the short chain fatty acids, the butyric acid, acetic acid, and propionic acid. So it does make sense that yes, we need to have the right amount of fiber, but we have to make sure that the system that that fiber is going into can accept it and use it properly. Otherwise, it's just going to backfire on us and make us actually sicker. So fiber is like a genetic switchboard. It controls what genes get turned on and off in your body. And again, the microbiome has genes that we don't have. So that means they perform functions that we cannot perform on our own. How does this all relate to burnout? When we're feeding the weeds, those weeds are producing toxins. They're producing acids and gases that disturb the good bacteria. In fact, can even kill them off or cause them to overgrow. So the microbiome is part of the immune system. They're there to defend, as well as do all the other things we talked about before. When they are invaded, so to speak, by the weeds or the bad bacteria or yeast or parasites, they will overgrow. They will start to divide and multiply to try to defend their territory. Now, some of them will have casualties, right? So we sometimes see some of the species will die off, and then others will overgrow. So this is what dysbiosis is. Now, as they're doing that, as all that chaos is going on in your gut, they're becoming dysfunctional. They're not making the acids they need to make. So they make the short chain fatty acids that we need for our body functions, which is very different than what the bad bacteria make. They don't make the short chain fatty acids. They make lactic acid and other toxic types of acids that actually damage the gut and damage the microbiome. So when this is going on in your gut, this is triggering stress responses. And again, those stress responses lead directly to burnout if they're going on for too long. By too long, I mean a few months to years. Sometimes this is going on for decades in some of my clients. And this is why I often hear my clients say, I eat so healthy and I still feel so lousy. I've changed my diet. I've taken out all the foods that cause me distress. I have such a restrictive diet now and I still don't feel well. And no matter how much I restrict my diet, eventually the foods I'm eating make me feel bad and I have to restrict it even more. And this is the vicious stress cycle that takes hold in the gut so that there's so much inflammation, there's so much damage in the gut that it's no longer a FODMAP issue. It's no longer, am I eating high or low FODMAP? Am I feeding the bad bacteria? It's also, I'm putting food into a damaged environment where I'm just triggering inflammation no matter what I do. This is the vicious stress cycle that leads us down the slippery slope of burnout. When the body perceives itself to be under stress for too long, it goes into fight or flight modes. And again, this is subconscious, so we're not going to feel panicked like we're being hunted down by a lion. That doesn't happen when it's subconscious stress. We're going to be going about our day. We just might not feel great. You might have bloating, might be tired, might have brain fog, but we're not being chased by a lion. But your body can't tell the difference. It doesn't know. It just knows it's stressed. And to your body, stress is stress. It's I'm being chased by a lion and that's all. It doesn't interpret stress any other way. This is what leads us down the slippery slope of burnout. You have, again, the increased demand of the body not feeling well, being stressed, constantly sending out distress signals that we're interpreting as these symptoms and side effects. That costs your body a lot of excess energy. So now it's, again, the demands are going up. The supply is going down because your gut health has been impacted. So now you're not absorbing. The microbiome's not making those vitamins that it needs to make. It's not making the short chain fatty acids running our body function because they're busy fighting infections and defending their territory. This creates this vicious cycle that causes burnout. So what's a better strategy than fiber maxing? So instead of fiber maxing, we want to fiber smarter. Step one, if you have side effects from increasing your fiber, that's a huge sign you should look for infections in your gut, and you should look for what we call dysbiosis, or the disturbance of the microbiome. So a SIBO test is indicated here, as well as a functional stool analysis. A functional stool analysis is very different than one that you would get at your regular doctor's office or at a gastroenterologist's office. The functional stool analysis does look at the microbiome. It looks at the function of the microbiome as well. Is it making those short-chain fatty acids? It looks at how many good bacteria there are, how balanced they are with each other, and then how functional they are. Also looks for absorption markers. It looks for inflammatory markers in your gut. Looks at whether or not you're making enough enzymes. Also looks for what we call damage or leaky gut. So that's something you can add on to a functional stool analysis to know if there is damage to the lining from the dysbiosis and the infection. So that's step number 1, is to find those weeds. Step number 2 is to kill them when you find them. So there are natural things that you can use to treat SIBO or to treat yeast in the gut or parasites in the gut. They don't necessarily have pharmaceuticals or antibiotics per se. So these are herbs and spices and essential oils that have also been studied to kill abnormal bacteria, yeast, and parasites in the gut without the exposure to the antibiotics that would further damage the microbiome. Then you repair the soil, right? We call that GI restoration or gastrointestinal restoration. Now that you've killed the weeds, you want to clean up, right? You're going to pull them out. You're going to perhaps replant the seeds of the vegetables and the herbs or the cuttings. You have to repair the soil in order to replant. We call that GI restoration. So again, these are natural things that you can use that will repair the lining, repair the mucous membrane of the gastrointestinal system to restore its integrity. Then we put the fertilizer in the soil. So that's where the fiber comes in. You want to make sure that you're having friendly fibers and not the high FODMAP ones. Even though we've gotten rid of all the weeds, we all know the weeds can grow back if we're not super careful. So we don't want to put super high FODMAP fibers into our gastrointestinal system, because these infections, this dysbiosis, comes from just us mingling with our environment. If I have a glass of water, I will inevitably swallow bacteria. If I eat an apple, I will inevitably swallow bacteria. Salad, using my utensils. There are microbes and bugs everywhere. We're designed to live around them, and it's supposed to be fine. But when we're under chronic stress, our immune system is not as vigilant as it needs to be. When we're under stress, our gastrointestinal system is not as mobile as it needs to be. The muscles don't contract as well as they should. And we also don't make as much hydrochloric acid to defend our gut when we're under chronic stress. So that's the perfect fertile ground for an infection to take hold. We don't want to be putting fertilizer for weeds into our gut, knowing that that could be going on at any point in time, especially if we're under stress. So having lower FODMAP fibers and using them to meet your requirements is a safer way to go. So examples of lower FODMAP fibers are guar gum, or what we call partially hydrolyzed guar gum, acacia, and what we call polyphenol-rich fruits and vegetables. We'll have a list a little bit further in the podcast for you. And then again, you want to do this crop rotation, right? Just like if we're farming responsibly, we want to rotate the crops so that we don't strip the soil of nutrients. So we want to have a variety of fiber, but keep it in the low FODMAP family. And that doesn't mean you can't have any high FODMAP foods. You just want to keep them to a minimum so that you're not overindulging in them. But you do want variety. So you want the base of your fiber to be more or less low FODMAP. And then you can introduce some high FODMAPs in small amounts. High FODMAP fibers are things that would be contained in broccoli, cruciferous vegetables in general, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. Oatmeal in large enough quantities is considered to be high FODMAP. So keeping that at a lower dose, so to speak, or lower amount is. So the takeaway is don't fiber max and be very aware of any side effects that you may have. And going slower and slower is not the solution. So quick recap, fiber is medicine, so we absolutely need it. And yes, we should be increasing our fiber, but not as a trend, in a very systematic way that makes sure that we're actually benefiting our bodies, not harming them. So in a healthy gut, fiber is medicine, and it helps to heal the gut, helps our bodies to function optimally. But if the garden is full of weeds, if there are infections, SIBO, yeast infections, parasites, dysbiosis, and imbalance of the good bacteria, then we're actually making ourselves sicker and we're fueling burnout, not our bodies. A quick list of friendly fibers that you can consume safely. Green kiwis, low doses of psyllium husk, and acacia fiber is a great option. Zucchini, cucumbers, spinach, kale, collards, spinach, kale, collards, eggplant, and cooked tomatoes. Now watch the seeds and the skin. If you're very sensitive, you don't want to have that portion of the tomato. For fruits, mostly berries. So strawberries, blueberries, raspberries. We already mentioned green kiwi earlier. Oranges, clementines, and mandarins are also a great source of low FODMAP fibers. Green bananas and green plantains are another amazing source. They're considered to be prebiotics. So what we're talking about essentially are prebiotics. Fiber that feeds the good bacteria are considered to be prebiotics. They're essentially the fertilizer that feeds the microbiome. So green bananas and green plantains you would treat as though they were any other root vegetables. You could boil them and eat them. Now in the Caribbean, we talk about tostones, and in Creole we call it banan pesé. There are different ways that we can make those green plantains so that they're tasty, but very often we'll just boil them and eat them with any meal that we make. Cooked and then cooled white rice and white potatoes are also considered prebiotics. We mentioned oats earlier, but again, make sure you have those in lower quantities. Chia seeds, flax seeds, and pumpkin seeds are great sources. Again, keep those on the lower side. You don't want to have huge servings of these things. Then again, they can backfire. So some common high FODMAP foods that we want to be a bit cautious with if we have dysbiosis and gut infections like SIBO, or even if you just have IBS. If you've been diagnosed with IBS, the likelihood that you have dysbiosis and SIBO is actually quite high. So this also applies to people diagnosed with IBS. You want to avoid having too much beans and lentils and chickpeas, for example. These are considered high FODMAP. In other words, they're more likely to feed the weeds. Large servings of oatmeal, also considered high FODMAP. So there are certain foods that if you have them in small quantities, they'll be considered low FODMAP. But if you exceed a certain amount, they become high FODMAP. So you want to be aware of that. And there are some really reliable apps that you can download. Monash University out of Australia is what I commonly recommend to my clients to use when I'm recommending that they be on a low FODMAP diet for any specific period of time. Now, you don't want to go on a low FODMAP diet. That's different. I'm just talking about the fibrous foods that you would use to help feed the good bacteria. So you don't want to be on a FODMAP diet. So be cautious that you're not having just low FODMAP foods in your entire diet. That's not safe to do for extended periods of time because it's too restrictive. Again, if you're finding that you have to do that to feel well, there's something going on in your gut that you shouldn't. Dried fruit is a huge culprit for high FODMAP, as are apples, pears, mangoes, and wheat bran also is considered a high FODMAP fiber. Instead of dumping beans and oats and chia seeds into everything, try zucchini, carrots, berries, or guar. These will feed the good bacteria without feeding the weeds and fueling your burnout. So I hope you found this podcast to be helpful. If so, please share it with someone you love so that they too can benefit from the information. Please like and subscribe to our channel. If you want to know more, sign up for our 7-day challenge coming up soon, where we'll give you actionable tips that you can apply immediately to start getting yourself out of burnout now. Check out our website, awakenedwellnessnow.com. If you want to know about our corporate programs, you can check them out on our website as well. Thanks for listening and watching, and until next time, many, many blessings. Thank you.